Hello there. Thanks for joining us. My name is Alex Marland. I'm the Jarislowsky Chair in Trust and Political Leadership and a professor of Canadian politics at Acadia University in Nova Scotia. And I'm joined today by the great Beatrice Wayne. Hi, Beatrice.
Hi, so glad to be talking to you.
Why don't you tell everyone what you do at the Samara Centre?
So, I'm the Director of Research and Policy at the Samara Centre for Democracy. We're a nonpartisan charity dedicated to supporting civic engagement in Canada. And I direct research and help direct the policy recommendations that come forth from the Samara Centre. And it's a really fun job because I get to engage in the sort of research I'm passionate about, and I get to talk to really interesting people about why they're passionate about Canadian democracy.
And hey, my job as a professor gives me opportunities to talk to great people like Beatrice. So, one of the things that I do is I study all sorts of elements about Canadian politics, about members of parliament, provincial legislators, the kinds of things they're doing in the legislature, but also outside the legislature, party politics, and all this sort of thing. And it was inevitable that I was going to entertain work put together by the Samara Centre for Democracy because they do all sorts of great publications and podcasts that I find really useful for my students, but I also find really useful for my research. So, um, Beatrice, why don't you tell us about some of that? In particular, let's start with the MP exit interviews, which is a really bold, amazing project.
I love starting talking about the work of Samara with the MP Exit Interview Project because that's really the foundation of Samara, why it was created in the first place, and says so much about how we approach research and how we understand the lived experience of politics in Canada. So, this project started in 2008 with the founders of the Samara Centre, Alison Lote and Michael McMillan. And they were very active citizens, very civically engaged, but they also came from business backgrounds and they had questions about politics. And when thinking through really wanting to understand how policy decisions are made, what it was really like to be an MP in the House of Commons and how they could better understand how politics was really being practiced, they realized something from the business world that they were experienced with. Exit interviews were not something that existed for politicians in Canada. And they thought about what a rich entry point for better understanding how politics really plays out in our country. And they decided that what they were going to do was try to do a series of exit interviews with former MPs who have left office. And the reason why they thought exit interviews would be so compelling and so productive is because they've left office. They could be really honest. They can be really forthcoming. They are not running for anything anymore. They can now really be reflective and thoughtful about what the experience of serving in the House of Commons was really like, what they thought were positive takeaways, and what they thought should change to have a healthier, stronger democracy in Canada. So they went across country and they did interviews in former MPs' homes. And that was, I think, a really exciting, unexpected experience and brought forth these really, really rich interviews, which created the basis of the MP Exit Interview Project, which now is a long running project. We've done over 165 interviews with former members of parliament across the 38th to 43rd Parliament, with politicians across the political spectrum from different parties, different demographics. And it's now this really rich repository, this archive of political experience in Canada. And it's both, I think, really informative, but also really compelling to listen to. I think it's a great way for Canadians to connect in a real experiential way with Canadian politics.
So that's a great summary. I can tell you, I remember when all of this was started out, and there was so much conversation about their book, Tragedy of the Commons. Even many years later, people still talk to me about it. Politicians across Canada still go around clutching it and talking about it because what it does is it really, and the exit interviews as a whole, as well as a series of reports that are on the Samara Center's website that I find very useful. It kind of reveals almost like the good, the bad, and the ugly of Canadian politics. And as you said, Beatrice, like when you're an elected official, like you're kind of careful about what you say. I mean, anybody who has a job is careful, right? Like so you could work at a grocery store, you could be in any sort of retail environment, or you could work for a big law firm. It doesn't matter what your job is. You're not going to go out and publicly talk about all the problems that are going on. But once you're no longer in that position, you may feel like you can now open up a little more. And that's especially the case in Canadian politics. What kinds of things have MPs said in these exit interviews, Beatrice?
Really interesting things. I think going into it initially, Alice and Michael expected there to be a lot of very strong focus on policy that they liked or didn't like. And they were really surprised to learn more about the experience on an individual level, how the experience of the House of Commons shaped people, shaped what they expected politics to be, and how their identity changed once they were in office. So the a couple of the consistent findings that really have tracked across the different parliaments we've looked at is a tendency of politicians to see themselves as political outsiders, even when we would not necessarily, as citizens, identify those people as political outsiders. They are often active citizens with lots of connections to different levels of government, but the tendency to really, even in the House of Commons, even sometimes cabinet ministers, thinking of themselves in a way as political outsiders is really interesting. And I think it says something larger about our politics. Another interesting takeaway is, and you will understand this and have a lot to say about this, is the power of parties and how much, even in a political system where there seems to be a lot of cohesion around parties, where there's a lot of voting that happens that shows party power and agreement in within caucuses, on an individual level, we hear again and again MPs complaining about their own parties. I think that, in fact, Alison and Michael expected to hear much more sort of partisan complaints about how other parties acted. And in fact, what we hear quite often is complaints about actions within their own caucuses, within their own parties, and a feeling that things aren't working in the way that these MPs would like them to work. And sort of often a disavowal of a strong affiliation with their own party. It's an interesting theme that often comes up in these interviews.
Yeah, and I know that because I've looked at a lot of the transcripts. Samara Centre has been very helpful for me, and I know that upon request you can get a hold of these transcripts and analyze them the way that I have, along with some other people, and it's really been useful for some of my publications, my published work. Okay, so now I mentioned that in these exit interviews with MPs, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So let's start with the good. Let's start with something positive. The world could use some more positivity. What are some of the good things that the Canadians who get elected and sit as members of parliament have to say about that role?
I think the number one takeaway is how meaningful it is to them, how much being a public servant is something that they understand to be a huge responsibility and a huge honor. And they often talk, and I think this is something that is great to really listen to the voices of MPs themselves, and which is why we created the Humans of the House podcast based on the MP exit interviews, so that you could really hear these MPs in their own words talk about their experiences. And when you hear them talk about what it means to walk into the House of Commons for the first time, when you hear about them talk about the honor of being elected and wanting to represent their community, and that's what we hear. That is why people run. They talk about being inspired by grassroots groups in their communities, wanting to make positive change in their local neighborhood, really being inspired by a sense of civic obligation. We hear beautiful stories that in these interviews that I think sort of counteract a lot of the negative association that we have when we think about politicians. Often there is this tendency to dehumanize them, to think of them as antagonistic to the public. And I think hearing about how meaningful it is for them and how highly they respect the obligation of the work that they take on is really meaningful. And I think another interesting and positive aspect is, in the MP exit interviews, they've left office, and often it's been in very painful ways for them, in experiences that were very hard and challenging. They had lots of negative things to say, sometimes about their experience with party leadership, with getting online abuse. There are a lot of challenges to the job, and yet overwhelmingly, most of them talk about how it was a really meaningful experience for them, that they don't regret running for office. That's really key, that they don't regret running for office or serving in office, and that they hope younger generations make the choice to do so. And so those are some of the positive takeaways from those interviews.
Yeah, and I'll build on that both in terms of what I've read and heard in the interviews and read in Samara publications and in interviews that I've done with politicians. Many of them are just feel this sense of it's just so important to be there, and the sense of awe when they walk into the House of Commons and they take their seat and they realize this is real, this is really happening. The sense of purpose that they have, of giving back to their community, of representing people, of learning about how vast Canada is and all the different types of diversity of both types of people, but problems and issues that people face and challenges that exist for politicians to try to confront, and how public policy is a multifaceted web, how it's so complicated, and everything that seems simple, they realize why it's actually so much harder to do things. But also this sense of camaraderie. They build friendships. Often those friendships are across party lines. There are loads of people who say they have more in common sometimes with people in other parties than they necessarily do within their own party. And there's reasons for that. It could be stage of life. It could be common interests. It could be simply lots of things that have nothing to do with politics, that they met each other and they traveled together or whatever the case may be. So ultimately, I've yet to hear politicians who say running for office and getting elected was the worst mistake I ever made in my life. You don't hear that. People say it was a privilege, it was an honor. And so it's something very profound that changes their life. Now, that being said, I mentioned that we would get to some of the bad before we get to the ugly. So you've hinted at some of it, Beatrice. What would be bad but not ugly that you hear from MPs in their exit interviews?
I would say, and you alluded to this before, that we hear a lot about cross-partisan friendships and camaraderie and connecting. I think the bad is when they talk about having to downplay, hide, or not acknowledge these friendships and working across party lines. They feel, and we hear often MPs talk about performing in the House of Commons, in performing in question period, and feeling like they have to portray this real antagonism, real, heckling, but also just a dislike of like a visceral dislike of each other. Then when the cameras are off and they leave the room, they're making plans to have dinner together. They're good friends, but they feel obliged to perform this hostility that I think is not productive, and they don't think is productive either, and they think it actually stymies an ability to work constructively together. Often they talk about some of the best work they do and the most rewarding work they do being in committees and being able to have opportunities to work in a cross-partisan fashion there, to really dive deep into the policy issues they care about and to learn more about this vast country and how these policy decisions could have these larger implications. But they also feel like they don't have the time or attention really to devote to that, and they still have a lot of these party pressures that limit the kind of cross-partisan work that they want to do. Overwhelmingly, they want to do.
Yeah, and I mean, to that, I'd say that some of them find it absolutely maddening that you can't just interact with people from the other side and be seen, especially in an age of, social media, and you have smartphones all over the place that could capture that, and who knows how it gets torqued online. It makes me think that Jean Chrétien, former Prime Minister of Canada, once said that, you go into politics and you have your elbows up and, you're beating people in the corners, but then afterwards you go out and you have a beer together. But even that is problematic, because this idea that political parties are like combative teams really brings to the forefront that, in the research I've done anyway, that it looks to me like, these are structured, that were really designed to be combative, that we're very much saying, well, we have the government and we have the opposition and they have to face off against each other. And so the whole idea that you're always about undermining the government, or the government is always saying that it's fantastic and can never admit fault. I mean, there are definite challenges in how things exist. And I would encourage any viewers or listeners to look into the models that exist without political parties in Nunavut and Northwest Territories to get a sense of what a small legislature, not a big one, but what a small legislature can do in the absence of political parties. So now, Beatrice, that takes me to the underbelly of Canadian party politics and parliament. What is some of the ugly?
Some of the ugly, one thing I will say that has been escalating that we see in the interviews that has changed from 2008 until now is the ubiquity of online harassment. This has now become a condition of work for members of parliament. This is something that they face, and I think it's not only they themselves that face it, but their families, their staff, volunteers. It's something that they are exposed to. And the fact that it has become a condition of work is not just a problem for scaring people off who might want to run, but sees this as a bridge too far in dealing with, but also threatening people staying, people wanting to run again, to stay in Parliament because they've had too negative an experience that they feel like they can't continue to expose their family, expose their staff to this level of vitriol. It's really threatening, I think, for having a robust representative democracy to have this as an ongoing condition of work. And I think that I would point people to another project we have called our SAMBOT project, which tracks abuse towards candidates running for elected office. And we've seen this is an issue across levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal. And it's really shaping who's running for office and who's deciding to stay in office.
Yeah, and research, this is alarming, but research was showing for quite a while that a lot of us were thinking that this was directed towards women, racialized candidates, LGBTQ, and others. But in fact, research is now showing that it's everybody. Everybody is getting it, regardless of your background, what sorts of, uh, you know, characteristics people may perceive. Sure, some people are getting it worse, but the bottom line is everybody is getting it. And this is absolutely a challenge. Just the other day, I had a couple of members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly in my class, including a minister. And one of the students said, talk to me about, this online discourse that you get. And they both immediately said, oh, yeah, we get death threats. And people in the class were just like, what do you mean? And they just said, well, you don't hear about it. We don't go around and advertise when we get it. And then the minister said, yeah, no, I've had to have security. And this is just seen as a normal part of politics nowadays, that did not used to be like this. And so it's definitely a challenge. So, a positive thing, of course, is when the Samara Centre uses its Sandbot or others to get people talking about this, then what it can do is it can lead us to conversations about what can be done about it. Does the Samara Centre have any suggestions about what we can do to make political discourse in Canada easier for people, or to make running for politics not so daunting for anybody who is worried or turned off by that?
I think we have to first acknowledge it as a problem. We have to create supports and understand that this is something that affects not just high profile people running for public office. It affects first time candidates. We've seen this, and this is a big problem. First time candidates will not have the same resources and support mechanisms that somebody who is an established member of parliament running again will have access to. So we really need to make sure that our institutions have really strong supports for first time candidates, social media policy so they know what they can and cannot do in terms of blocking people who are threatening them, know what to do when they do receive death threats or harassment. This needs to be acknowledged as a problem, and supports need to be institutionalized across levels of government. But moreover, I think we really need strong digital platform regulation so we address this problem at the root cause instead of moving only to have a triage effect at the end for politicians.
So I'd like to turn now to humans of the House. So the MP exit interviews, for the most part, are really written format. So you end up seeing transcripts, or they get turned into books and journal articles by the Samara Centre, researchers like me and others. But hearing voices is very different, and the quality that of humans of the House as podcasts is actually quite impressive. And one of the things I really like about the format is it is, aside from hearing voices and kind of and connecting with the people who are on there, it's also the portability of a podcast, of course, right? I mean, anybody paying attention to us right now doesn't need explaining about that. But I can tell you in my case, I was listening to Humans of the House during a very long drive from Halifax up to Cape Breton. And it was just riveting to be able to hear one after the other. Whereas I don't know that I would have sat down and read all that. Certainly I wouldn't while I was driving. Or in class, this is how I've used it as a class resource. Just the other day, what I did, and I sent round one of the podcasts to students, and I said, okay, listen, if you want, you can listen to this and go for a walk around campus and then come back and we're going to discuss it. For those of you who don't want to go for a walk, you can stay in class and we're going to put it over the speakers. And so what happened was students were going around for a walk who wanted to stretch their legs or just get immersed in it. And others stayed in the class, and then everybody came together, and then we were able to talk about it. So we were taking breaks and we were going through it. But Humans of the House is a fantastic resource in the classroom that brings politics to life in a way that just hearing two people talk like you and I never could. What are your thoughts about Humans of the House? Who is it that you were trying to speak to?
We were trying to speak to people who feel a little disconnected from politics right now, who I think were curious, wanted to understand how our politics works, but have a hard time making that emotional connection, really engaging and feeling like they can understand on a personal level how our politics is working. And we really wanted to have a broad audience too. We wanted to have high school students connect with politics in Canada, and we wanted older folks to also connect with it and learn more. And we've had a really positive feedback and reaction. We work closely with teachers, and I'm so excited to hear about what a great way to approach the listening activity in your classroom. I'm going to have to share that with other professors because I love that. But we've worked very closely with high school teachers to create curriculum connected activities so that it could be really easily integrated into classrooms across provinces and territories, that it features very clearly into existing social studies and civics curriculum. But the real idea is that it should be deeply accessible. We also thought too, one of the takeaways from the MP Exit interviews is that it's a very different experience depending where the politician is from in Canada, and that you have politicians who every week have to take very long flights, multiple connecting flights to get to Ottawa. And we were thinking this would be very good material for them to listen to on those airplanes. We really wanted to make it very accessible, both in terms of being able to connect to the material, but also to access it. And that's why we also have transcripts for people who like to read along with the podcast. We have time-stamped transcripts on the website for people as well.
Neat. So here's what worked with me is I put on the screen, and so I then had closed captions underneath. And so what was happening is everybody was reading the closed captioning, which was helping with their hearing. And it's different types of learning, which was really useful. Some other things that came out that were really neat was it's very clear that the Samara Centre was very concerned about diversity. So there is a broad array of voices. There's a lot of attention paid to Indigenous perspectives, for example. You hear from both men and women, but people right across the country. Some of the things that I really noticed was whenever, I'm in Nova Scotia, and whenever there was mention of Nova Scotia, everybody just kind of sat up and listened a little more. And so I think that people across the country wherever they are, would notice that there is a definite effort to include people from different parts of the country. And that can connect with people in a different way. So one other thing that I learned about Humans of the House is really just bringing to life how much parliamentarians want to talk about the job. But yet it can be hard to talk about the job when they're doing it because you're so busy, plus you're constrained. But was that your sense that they want to talk about it?
Absolutely. This is, and we've talked about this as a team often, that sometimes you'll start an interview and the interviewee will be a little wary. They're not going to be sure exactly where the interview will go. But once you really show an interest in their experience and what it was like for them and how they approached their job, they really want to talk about it. They really want to share. And they have a lot of valuable knowledge that they've accrued over their years serving in office. And almost always, we allot 90 minutes for the interview. Almost always they want to keep talking past that time because they have a lot to say. And unfortunately, something we've learned from the interviews is that often after they're out of office, people stop speaking with them in the same way. People stop sort of asking for their opinion and knowledge, and they have a lot to say that hasn't been captured yet. So I think it's a really, really valuable repository of experiences that we need to keep collecting and we need to keep capturing because there's so much richness there.
Yeah, and I've definitely had politicians say to me, and in fact, there's an author from Ontario by the name of Steve Paikin, and he's written about this, that once you leave politics, everything seems slow because it's so fast paced in politics, and you're constantly in demand. And then all of a sudden, you're no longer a politician, and your phone isn't going as often, and there's not a bombardment of texts and emails and requests for your time. And so it sometimes I find that people, once they're out of the game, they're happy to have sort of that richness and share that energy. Beatrice, we've got about 5 minutes left, and maybe we could just finish off by giving everybody an understanding of the Samara Centre itself. So, when I think of the Samara Centre and a lot of my colleagues in Canadian political science, it tends to be the written publications, a lot of reports that come out, often with lots of fantastic infographics that explain things better than a boring professor ever could. Obviously, there's Tragedy of the Commons, there's Sambot, of course, there's Humans of the House. So your website is an incredible resource. You also have your beautiful offices in downtown Toronto. But ultimately, the Samara Centre is people. And so maybe you can just give me a sense of the vibe of what it's like to work at the Samara Centre and what is it that motivates everybody.
It's wonderful. We have a really, really energetic and a really collaborative team. And I think the thing that really brings us together is the fact that we have this passionate belief in the importance of civic engagement and the fact that Canadian democracy is dynamic and exciting, even though that's not always those are the first words that come to mind when you think of Canadian democracy, but it is.
Hey,
And
who's speaking? I think that.
and that there are so many different entry points and ways to enter into Canadian politics. And I think we have a team that each comes from a different angle, but really cares deeply about civic engagement. And I think that's really that there are so many different entry points into being an active citizen, into positively shaping your community, into engaging with your elected official. And the mission of the Samara Centre is really to make that engagement easier, to make that entry point more accessible. And all of our research and our resources and our events are aimed at that goal.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that we're able to connect. I know that my goal as a Jarislowsky Chair in Trust and Political Leadership is to encourage people to get involved in politics and hopefully think about running and who knows, maybe get elected and maybe even be a leader someday. But of course, we know that leadership takes on many forms. Beatrice, thank you for showing your leadership today and telling us all about the Samara Centre for Democracy and all its good works to help us better understand and appreciate Canadian democracy.
Thank you so much, Alex. This was such a fun conversation.
All right, thanks.